Let's implement mana burn as a passive ability. In most games, passive abilities are abilities that don't need activation, and in Dota 2, they can be disabled using a break status effect. And when the break status effect wears off, the passive ability continues to activate for a certain event, which in this case is on a melee hit. Welcome to Chapter 5 and Topic 2, Passive Ability Mana Burn, where we shall be replicating the Mana Burn passive ability from Animage in Dota 2. In the first step, we will be setting up our character and playing his animations. In the base and pawn folder, we shall create a child of the Blueprint Hero class, and this shall be named Animage as in Dota. We shall change the material of this character's mesh, and the easiest way that I could think of for now is to go to this minion class and find the Unreal Engine 4's default material in their folder. We shall copy these materials into our base and pawn folder, and we shall just change the color of this color node to purple, somewhere around here, in order to make it uniquely identifying for our Animage character. We can also update this chest logo material to bear the same material as the newly created Animage body material. And now let's add these newly created materials into this Animage character's skeletal mesh. And into a new dedicated folder for this character Animage, you can move your newly created character and his materials. Let's attach a sword to this character, for which I shall use one of the freely available weapon pack assets from Fab. When you do add to your project, you will notice this folder, Weapon Pack, within which you can search for a sword static mesh. This is a sword we will be using. It looks pretty good. You can add a static mesh to the skeletal mesh, and in Unreal Engine 5.5, it pre-populates a static mesh from your project. If it doesn't, simply replace it with another static mesh in your project directory. We can attach this static mesh to a socket of the parent skeletal mesh that it is attached to, for which I shall choose weapon_R. If you want to see your mesh sockets, you can find the skeleton asset of this skeletal mesh, which for Unreal Engine 4 mannequin is placed in the same folder alongside the skeletal mesh. In the skeleton tree of the skeleton asset, you can search for a pre-existing socket, which for UV4 we have weapon_R or L for right or left. You can still make your own socket by right-clicking on a bone and choosing Add Socket, which will be added as attached to that bone. We will continue to use the weapon_R. We only need to change the rotation of the sword along this x-axis. And we shall do just that for 180 degrees. So the sword has rotated along this x-axis. And we are ready to use this character in our game, which can be done in the SRC and game folders base game mode, by replacing the Blueprint Hero with Animage. We want to play melee animations for this character, for which I will use the Paragon's Quang characters animations. Simply add that into your project. You should see a folder, Paragon Quang, and when you apply the filter for animation sequence and search for attack, you will find these attack animations. We're interested in these 4 attack animations. So create a new folder in the base, assets, animations, melee for Animage, and copy these animations into that folder. We can then simply replace the skeleton with our UV4 mannequin, and you will notice the UV4 mannequin doing the animations in these sequences. Now, we can make animation montages out of these animation sequences, and making sure we're still using Animage in our game mode, let's try melee in our level. Notice how the melee animation is still our old melee punching animation. This is because in our melee gameplay ability, we are querying for animations by hard-coding a row name into this data table. We must choose a new row name for a new owning character. In the base and model folder, open up the data table animations. Notice how we only have 2 rows from where we're querying for the character's animations. Let's create a new row for the Animage character and append it with _C, since Unreal Engine class names bear _C at the end. This is a row structure of this data table. For an ability class, we have a list of animation montages. So from the base, assets, animations, melee, and Animage folder, we shall add these animation montages into this data table. So sequentially, add each one of these animation montages into this data table's ability class key. Although, we still need to access each row dynamically by its name for different owning characters of this ability. So we can do this by getting the avatar actor from the actor info of this ability, and by using its class display name into the row name input parameter of the getDataTable row blueprint node. Which is why I would prefer using data assets instead of data tables, which allows querying for using default classes and not names. And these data assets can be configured to have their own getter methods to get the data directly, rather than having to get a row name and query for an ability class further. So this dynamic row name implementation must be done in every other ability that uses this data table, such as in your block ability and in your dash ability. And now in my level, I can do the right melee animations for this character. Sure, we can make a few adjustments to the character's animations later, but our core functionality is in place. We can now move on to the next section, sword collision and performing melee hit. We now have two problems. One, the character's sword has collision and poking at the target character, and two, we're not yet registering a hit on the target character. Let's go to the animage class in the base, spawn, and animage folder and set up the melee collision for this character. For the properties of the sword static mesh, we need to make sure simulate physics is turned off if it was enabled, and we need to change its collision from blocking. Simply change the collision preset to overlap all dynamic and make sure to generate overlap events. Also make sure to disable character step up on, which ensures that character can't really register this static mesh and cause issues like bouncing off or handling landing events. And finally, we need to implement the onComponentBegin overlap event, which produces this blueprint event to handle the beginning of any overlap with another actor, which is where we can use our combat component and call its method performMelee, if you remember from chapter 2. This is our existing implementation of performMelee method. We first validated the target hit actor, checked to see if it was not our owner actor, and then checked to see if melee was being performed or not. If it wasn't being performed, we didn't proceed with the later implementation of melee. This boolean gate was activated and deactivated in these melee begin and melee end methods, which was also being invoked in the blueprint hero class in the combat interface methods, melee begin and melee end. What this means is we need to turn on and off our melee perform during the melee swing so that we can activate and capture the overlapping actors in our arc or swing of the melee action. This must be done during our swing animations using anim notify states. In our base, assets, animations, ANS folder, let's open up our ANS melee. In this anim notify state, we have defined our receive notify begin and end methods to invoke that melee begin and end interface methods for the owner of this mesh component. So this ANS is good to go. There is no extra work needed, and we can have it used in the anim montages. It would help to see the weapon in the hands of the character while trying to set the beginning and the end of the anim notify state. Right-click on the weapon _r socket and choose Add Preview Asset, where you can add your static mesh sword, although it is expected to see the sword misaligned in the hands of the character. Simply reset the relative rotation of the weapon socket, align the camera angle for a better view of your character, and use the rotation gizmos of the weapon socket to align the preview sword at an appropriate angle. And now, this looks a lot better. Now, you want to set the melee opening just as the sword crosses the character's body. So placing the seeker right at this point, we can add the anim notify state, ANS melee. And as the weapon reaches over the character's body, right here, we can end the melee notify state, pulling the end just over the seeker for more tolerance. Now that the socket has been set for preview, it will reflect in other anim montage assets as well. Likewise, we can add the ANS melee on our timeline, align the camera to see the character and the weapon better, and once again, just as the sword crosses the character, we set the beginning of the anim notify state, and seek to the point where the sword is almost reaching the character's body to mark the end of the anim notify state. Likewise, for the anim montage C, we want to do the melee begin right there, and once again, just before crossing the body, melee end. Finally, for D, this is the point of sword crossing the body for melee begin, and when he traces the arc, just before crossing his body, melee end. So now, for all of your anim montages, the notify state's beginning and end methods are called in this interval. And so, the melee begin and end is executed to enable and disable melee. The melee begin and end in question is actually the activation and deactivation of melee and clearing of a certain hit actor array, if you remember. Meaning, perform melee will always happen during an overlap, and if is performing melee is false, we can stop any further execution. However, if is performing melee is true, we continue the execution, where we check to see if the target is already being operated upon in our hit actor array. If it is, the actor may have wrongly been detected twice in the overlap, and we return, preventing us from operating on that target actor once again. And finally, for the single target actor, we can ensure we apply the melee effect only once. If the relative rotation of the weapon socket messed up the rotation of your sword, simply reset the sword's relative rotation from the socket to 0. When I play my level and get close to my target actor, the melee target is actually being detected and the damage effect is being applied. So our combat component is being seamlessly integrated into our system. We just need to make sure we have the right overlap collision calling perform melee method, correctly set up anim notify states that call melee begin and melee end methods, and even the server performing this character's animation in the visibility based anim take property. It should be set to always tick pose or always tick pose and refresh bones. And this concludes the first half of this topic. The second half is fairly simple. We shall implement the gameplay ability mana burn. Let's create a new ability in the ability system, abilities, and anti-mage folder, subclassing from the gameplay ability class called gameplay ability mana burn. Let's make sure to grant this ability first in the anti-mage class, in the initial ability container, if you remember from chapter 1. Create a new slot for the ability container, ability.slot.to, and pass in the value gameplay ability mana burn class. Now back in the gameplay ability mana burn class, we need to implement this function activate ability from event, like we did in the previous topic. We can break this event data payload and switch on the event tag. For a certain gameplay tag, combat.melee.hit, which has been added to my project in one of those JSON files and gameplay tag data tables. For now, let's just log a message and check to see if we are receiving this melee target actor from this gameplay event data payload. Also, let's not forget to set the ability trigger for the gameplay event of the trigger tag combat.melee.hit. For now, let's not use any cooldown or cost for this ability. Now, in the combat component class, we're applying damage in the very end of the perform melee, right? The next step will involve sending a gameplay event of the event tag combat.melee.hit to the owner of this ability. We will make an event data payload which will bear this incoming melee target actor. So the melee effect will be applied before in this server method for the perfect dodge, parry, block, and then melee damage. So in my level, when I perform melee on an actor, notice how both the server and the client get the melee target actor. This brings us to the final section, mana burn and break status. In the mana burn implementation, we shall apply an effect after we receive combat melee hit event. We shall get the ability system component from the actor info and get the method apply gameplay effect to target. We shall get the ability system component of the target actor and simply pass in that into the target parameter of this apply effect to target node. Let's create a new gameplay effect class for this in the base, ability system, effects, anti-mage, mana burn. Simply subclass from the gameplay effect class. This is nothing but an instant gameplay effect operating on an attribute mana for a scalable magnitude of 30. So let's just use this new gameplay effect class in here and test in our level. Notice how the melee target actor is taking damage to his mana. Now it's time to apply the break effect like in Dota 2, which prevents activation of passive abilities. If you remember, in the ability system, effects, and disables folder, I had gameplay effects for disable statuses in the game, like silence, root, disarm, and stun. Alongside those, we shall make another gameplay effect break. This will be a duration effect for 4 seconds in magnitude in order to test. The components category helps define how the gameplay effect behaves. That is, it helps block abilities from activation, grants some gameplay abilities, have immunity to other effects, and so on. With the help of gameplay tags, when this effect is active, we should choose to grant tags to target. We're going to add a tag to this effect, state pawn break. Now, we need to block the activation of this ability under that effect. This can be done using this property, activation block tags. Adding the tag state pawn break here will mean blocking the activation of this ability if the ability's owner ASC has that tag, which is indeed granted by that break gameplay effect. It is as simple as that. For testing purposes, let's go to the base, src, and game folders base player controller. Here, I wish to apply the break effect on a debug key press. So upon pressing the debug key 5, a server RPC is performed that simply applies a break effect to self. Server RPC, since effects are applied only on the server, and this is locally activated. So now when I attack the target actor, he loses mana, and when I apply break, he doesn't seem to lose mana on melee hit. And when the melee effect wears off after 4 seconds, mana burn continues to activate. Let's end this topic with a simple assignment. I want you to create another ability that passively applies break effect on a melee target hit. This actually means, quite like applying the mana burn effect on a melee target hit, we just need to apply the break effect for a certain duration. This is like simulating the Silver Edge effect in Dota 2, where upon attacking a target actor under that effect, you apply the break effect on that actor. Thank you for sticking around till the end of this topic. I hope this topic was helpful in coming up with your own creative ways to drive many such cause and effect gameplay events. And I will be seeing you in the next one.